Hey, I'm happy to say I got a real pleasant surprise this week. It's not all too often that this happens, where I find a brand new game that I either didn't know about, or if I did, just didn't have much expectations for, but then I end up playing and really enjoying. Well, that is exactly what has happened with Last Epoch. This latest entry into the ARPG genre has been in early access since 2019, and after nearly 5 years of updates and improvements, it officially launched its 1.0 version this past week. Now, I hadn't known about this game, hearing things about it here and there over the years, and it was mostly positive word of mouth, but even still, looking at the gameplay didn't really ever sell me on the game, and so I just never ended up making the time to play. However, with it officially launching and being a fan of ARPGs, I figured it was about time I gave the game a shot, and I am so glad I did, because Last Epoch seems genuinely great so far. I'm not just pleasantly surprised, I am almost blown away by the level of quality of this game. I was not expecting it, quite literally. It far exceeded my expectations. Now, with that said, do keep in mind, this is an indie game from a small studio. I mention that because it does have an impact on the overall production quality when we're talking about things like the level of detail, the fidelity of assets, the gameplay feel, the overall look of the game. You can tell Last Epoch was made by a much smaller team and with a much smaller budget than compared to, say, Diablo 4 or Path of Exile 2. Many things about the game do look scaled back in comparison to those two, but ultimately that doesn't really matter. The only real important question is, for any game, is it fun to play? And so far from my time, Last Epoch seems very fun to play, and it really doesn't even matter how good or not your production quality is if the game's systems and features aren't up to snuff. And while I have not personally reached Last Epoch's endgame at this point, I have heard good things. This game is shaping up quite well and seems primed to be a strong contender in the ARPG genre. Now, I've spent the past couple of days playing, or at least when it was playable, as they've had some serious server issues up to this point, which we will get to that. But also, hey, they have an offline mode. Look at that. And even if it's not your preferred way to play, it sure is a heck of a lot better than the alternative of the online games that have server issues at launch, and you're just not able to play them at all until those issues are resolved. I was there for the launch of Diablo 3. I know how bad it can be. I mean, heck, you don't even have to go that far back. Look at Helldivers 2. That game has had persistent issues since it released, in many ways making it unplayable for a lot of people. The point is, offline mode is a great option. It's good for being there when you need it. More games should have it, and Last Epoch does. That's a great thing. So I'm not just here to gas the game up, though. I do want to talk in a little bit more detail about what I've seen so far and what I like. Before we do that, though, a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by World of Tanks Blitz. This is a cross-platform, free-to-play, team-based MMO action game dedicated to fierce tank combat, and it's also an MMO shooter that you can play on mobile. In World of Tanks Blitz, you'll discover a wide variety of over 450 historical and unique tanks, with 32 maps to choose from and 8 game modes where you'll employ a variety of strategies to take out your opponents. From February the 23rd until March 7th, players will be able to grab exclusive in-game content inspired by the Dune universe, a specially designed tank, static and animated avatars, exclusive camouflages, spectacular skins, and more. This event unfolds across 60 stages, each presenting distinct missions, special quests, Dune containers, and themed rewards. World of Tanks Blitz boasts over 150 million worldwide players. The game is available on iOS, macOS, Android, Windows 10, Steam, and Nintendo Switch. You can check it out by following my link in the description below. Also, you can enter for a chance to win tickets to see the upcoming movie Dune 2 in theaters by commenting below with your World of Tanks Blitz user ID and the correct house sigil, which you'll find somewhere else hidden in today's video. If you don't already have an account, you can download the game and create one for free. Okay, so now back into Last Epoch. We are a few days into release. What do I think of the game so far? Well, aside from my broadly positive first impressions that you heard me give at the start, here are some more specifics. Combat in this game seems really well done. The general flow, pacing, and feel of playing Last Epoch seems good. Moving your character around, attacking, casting spells, blowing up enemies, as well as the environment, it looks like a well-executed ARPG combat system. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the production quality isn't necessarily quite as high as a Diablo 4 or Path of Exile 2. It doesn't feel quite as chunky or as impactful as those games, but I would say it's pretty darn close and very good in its own right. I simply enjoy attacking things in this game, and I've been doing that while playing as my character of choice this time around, the Rogue. The Rogue has a few base abilities. There is Flurry, Puncture, and Cinder Strike. These are all core spammable attacks with different flavors, like Flurry performs 3 rapid attacks. Cinder Strike is a combo that includes a fiery AoE, and Puncture is a strong jab that inflicts bleeding. Now, what's interesting is that each of these attacks will be changing depending on whether or not you cast them while wielding a melee or a ranged weapon. These attacks are not tied to melee or ranged. They're either depending on what you feel like using. The Rogue's other core abilities are a Shuriken Throw, Acid Flask that debuffs enemies, and Umbral Blades that you toss out and recall, dealing damage on both the giving and receiving end. There's also a movement skill for Rogues called Shift. In addition to this, you've got a passive tree where you select from enhancements tailored to different playstyles and builds, and then as you spend points, you progress along this horizontal bar at the bottom, which then unlocks 3 additional abilities for the Rogue, which are the Smoke Bomb, Decoy, and Ballista, and every single one of the classes has a similar setup of core skills and then a passive tree which unlocks additional skills. Now, in addition to that, so in addition to the Rogue's 10 core skills that I just mentioned, each and every one of them has an entirely separate skill tree letting you specialize the skill further. So you can equip 5 skills that can be used at any given time in combat. Each of those can then be further specialized through the individual skills skill tree system. These are more than just damage multipliers, by the way, although there is that as well. In many cases, you have ways to entirely change how a skill functions. So instead of just having a game where you're playing a Rogue and you've got a Rogue skill tree and a Rogue passive tree, this game does it a little different, where you've got skill trees for each of the skills that you're using in your build and then picking from those individual trees. Then beyond those core class skills and that passive tree, there are masteries. Every single class has 3 subclasses basically called masteries, each of which then come with their own additional passive trees and skills. So as playing the Rogue, I decided to choose the Falconer mastery, which unlocks a falcon that follows me around attacking enemies. I can then also command the falcon to strike, which will then unleash a flurry of attacks in a large area. It's basically just a big area of effect ability. And then as you play, you level up, you can spend points in the Falconer passive tree, specializing in unlocking additional Falconer skins, which are the Explosive Trap, Net, Aerial Assault, and the Dive Bomb. And yes, you guessed it, every one of those skills also comes with their own individual skill tree that you can further specialize them in. So my current build while playing as my Falconer Rogue, it basically looks like this. I've got my Falcon Strikes, which is a heavy hitting attack. I will use this basically whenever it's off cooldown and there's more than just a single trash mob around. Then in between that, I am constantly throwing out explosive traps, as well as using my Puncture whenever the Rapid Strike is up and available. And then I have Smoke Bomb, a defensive skill that will blind enemies and boost my haste, and a traversal skill called Shift for quick movement and repositioning of my character. So I'm just running around throwing out Falcon Strikes. My Falcon is swooping in, doing damage to a wide swath, and then at the same time I'm throwing out these explosive traps, which after a second or so they arm and then blow up on enemies, and then machine gunning any stragglers down with my Puncture attack. And then when things get hairy, I might throw down a Smoke Bomb or shift away from the enemies. All of this combined with just the general good feel of the game's combat has resulted in a moment-to-moment gameplay loop that I find quite satisfying and right there in line with other big-name ARPGs that I've played. Like I said, it might not have quite the production quality of some of those higher budget games made with bigger teams, but it's close enough, and I think it feels really, really good, especially for what it is. The gameplay, it's good as far as I'm concerned. A little bit more about the game. From what I've seen through my initial playthrough, Last Epoch, it presents its campaign in a rather linear fashion. You're moving through the main story quest, going from one distinct named location to another, following these pre-established paths and zones. They're sometimes branching. You can approach an area from 2 different directions, but for the most part, you're moving to areas where your quest objectives are clearly marked, completing whatever your main objectives are, and then picking up side quests to do along the way. It is rather straightforward and also all pretty standard RPG fare in terms of what you're doing and how you're doing things. You know, you're killing enemies, you're interacting with objects, collecting things, finding and talking to NPCs. The game does appear to be fully voice acted as well, by the way, with things like the quest dialogue, the quality of which I have thought is decent. There's also a few cutscenes here and there in the game as well. But I think what I found the most interesting about playing through Last Epoch is how the game's world is structured. They've essentially built a world and then presented it on several different timelines. timelines. So as you play, you're moving through these different eras, which in many cases have you going through similar spaces with entirely different looks, enemies, and even structures to the environment. It is a time travel story. You're constantly going back and forth between these different eras as you unlock them, and as you move forwards or backwards, the world that you're presented with is a little bit different. I don't know how this will all culminate, as these are just first impressions. Like, again, I've not finished the game, I haven't reached max level, I'm not at end game, but up until this point, going through the campaign, how they've structured the world and its content, I have really enjoyed. This will inevitably be different come end game, no question. I'm sure you're going to be interacting with the world and these timelines quite differently, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Now, along the way, I've also come across a few really cool and interesting moments that stood out to me. Like at one point when I was inside of a cave, I could see far below in a ravine, there was this massive earth creature that was lumbering around. And then some of the backdrops on various areas like bridges and cliffs were really intriguing. In particular, one that stood out was the main town in the End of Time. You climb this floating rock bridge, and then in the background you see what I believe is a black hole or something sucking in planets. There's also a space dragon flying by, and just the setting, the backdrop, and the perspective that it all creates, I think they've done a pretty stand-up job here. A few other early standouts from the game include some of its various systems and features. Now, I've already discussed the skill system, where every single class ability has its very own skill tree, letting you enhance but also sometimes dramatically change how those skills work. I think this is just a really interesting and good way to present this. A little bit of a mix-up from, again, the traditional fare of I pick a rogue, I've got a skill tree for my rogue, and maybe a passive tree as well. This one says, hey, every single skill has its own skill tree, and I just like that level of tinkering that they're allowing you to do. Also, this game has an insanely thorough loot filter that lets you filter for basically whatever you want to hide or show. It's got conditions related to item affixes, class requirements, levels, rarity, and item type. You can apply up to 75 individual rules for a single filter, and then you can swap between these pre-saved filter templates that you've made, or even import filters that other players have created. This is about as thorough of a loot filter system that I've ever personally experienced in one of these games. Speaking of loot, item crafting is rather interesting. Like most ARPGs, you'll have items that drop with a random selection of stats and affixes, while last Epoch has this thing called the Forge that will let you change, swap, or upgrade the stats of any weapon or item that you find. This will be limited by an item's forging potential, which essentially represents the amount of changes you can make before you can no longer forge an item anymore. And then fueling into the system are the affix shards, which will drop. They're a resource for basically each affix in the game. You can even then, if you find items that you have good affixes, but you don't want the item itself, you can pull those affixes into individual shards and put them in your collection. And then there's also various modifiers for runes and support glyphs that further enhance the system. It sounds really complex, but let me tell you, I'm not the most complex person, and I got the hang of it after not too long. I understood the system after just tinkering with it for a little while, and I think it's quite well done. It's a good way to present crafting and item enhancement in your ARPG. And then, in addition to the basic paper doll loot that you equip, your basic armor pieces and weapons, they've also got this system of idols that provide additional power boost, and you arrange these in this like Tetris style tile box. They've got an in-game guide with a search function that lets you basically search for anything related to skills, items, crafting, combat, ailments, and the end game system of factions and monolith system. Basically, this is instead of having to tab out of the game and check out a wiki if you're looking for details about various aspects of it, they built all of that into the game. Love to see it. And then just recently we came across dungeons. Although I don't fully understand them, it does appear to be a little bit more than the traditional dungeon structure of clear ads and then kill a boss. While you are doing that, there's also some things in the mix, like you need a specific key to enter the dungeons. They will have multiple tiers of difficulty and then have unique mechanics, like the Lightless Arbor dungeon has this flame that buffs you, and as you move around, you use a basically dungeon ability key for it, and this is used to clear your paths and do extra damage to enemies. You can also take a lot more damage if you aren't in the light or something. The dungeon is broken up into several sections, each section having its own different debuffs, like taking extra damage. And then yes, you do have a boss at the end, because I guess it wouldn't be a dungeon without one. Again, don't quite fully understand the system, just recently came across it, but it does seem interesting from what I have seen. And frankly, that is just some of what I've liked so far. Really, I just wanted this video to be me getting my general thoughts on the game, because like I said at the top, this was a really nice, pleasant surprise. So you might assume, hey Force, if this game's looking good and sounding good, good, everything's smooth sailing, right? Well, not exactly. So it has been quite popular. The game seems to have picked up. It's reached recently nearly 200,000 concurrent players, which is rather insane and rather significantly above its prior all-time peak from a few years back, which was 40,000 concurrent players. It seems like releasing out of early access into 1.0 with all the positive word of mouth, lots of people were interested in checking out this game. That is really, really impressive for an indie RPG to be hitting near 200,000. By the time you watch this video, they might have surpassed that, or maybe not. We'll see, because it hasn't exactly been smooth sailing. While the general sentiment around the game itself has been positive, they have been having some massive issues with the servers being overloaded, resulting in frequent disconnects, but probably even more frequent is what you're seeing is long loading time between zones. I've seen a bunch of funny memes talking about this. You'll basically constantly be zoning into and out of areas between towns and different combat arenas and story arenas. This happens fairly frequently, and sometimes the time between going from one zone to the next can be many seconds, many even minutes at a time. I think I've waited upwards of like 5 minutes loading just from a town into the zone just outside of the town, and all of this is related to the strain that the servers are currently under. And it's one of those things where they're kind of suffering from success. People are enjoying this game, lots of people are jumping in to check it out, but as a result, the online experience for the people that are wanting to play this game hasn't exactly been great. We've seen this time and time again with games that require an online connection and have an abundance of players right at launch. It almost seems like it happens more times than not in these sort of circumstances. However, in Last Epoch's defense, they do have the off requested but not always included offline mode, and that is actually what I've spent about half of my time over these past few days playing. While the servers have been a mess, while connectivity and disconnects and long time loading between zones have been prevalent, I've just been going to offline mode and then basically juggling back and forth. While it has hindered my progress on each of the characters because I'm not dedicated to just offline or not dedicated to just online, I'm nevertheless enjoying playing the game. I think the core of the game is good, the foundation is good. I've really enjoyed what I've seen thus far. No, I've not finished it. No, I've not reached endgame. No, I'm not max level. This isn't an all-encompassing review by any means, but again, I was pleasantly surprised. I really am enjoying this. It's just as the words imply, it's been a pleasant surprise, and I'm happy to continue to jump in and keep playing. And at this point, we're just hoping that things smooth out, that the server issues get resolved, and that people can just enjoy playing the game without having to wait 5 minutes going from one zone to the next. We'll see what happens in the coming days and weeks. I hope things do improve. For the time being, I'm just as happy to play offline mode, but I know not everyone, that's not for everyone, right? Some people, they just want to play online. They just want to progress one character. They want to play that character with their friends. They want to do trading. And so offline mode isn't the solution for everyone, but I'm very happy that it is here. And all of this, and probably the cherry on top of this, is you get all of this in a package that costs less than a Diablo 4 mount. Can't beat it. $35 is the price of Last Epoch. Now, they do have cosmetic microtransactions in the game, but I have seen nothing pertaining to pay to win or pay to progression. It seems like it is just exclusively cosmetic. Either way, though, that's a nice entry price for what seems to be a pretty darn competent and well put together ARPG. I'm really enjoying it thus far. I'll keep you guys updated. Maybe we do a follow-up video, maybe more of a thorough and full review, but a few days in, I'm having a heck of a time, and I just kind of wanted to share that with you. Bear in mind, this upcoming weekend, probably going to be a mess. I don't expect the server issues to resolve as we move into Saturday and Sunday. Hopefully come early next week, though, things do start to get better. But at its core foundation, the game itself, Last Epoch, seems pretty darn good, and that makes me pretty darn happy. That does it for today. Thank you all for watching. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Take it easy.